Hello everyone, and welcome to wherever you are today for our third staff talk linking to the current meetings in Glasgow. So what are we going to consider today? I think it's obvious to everyone that we're going to have to change the way we live if we're going to build resilience worldwide. The presentations today in two parts. We'll look at the city of the future, but also what are we already doing on campus to ensure future sustainability? I've been thinking about this today and thinking that these ideas of change hasn't really caught on with our own leaders. As personally, I've been a bit confused about the COP so far. For instance, I couldn't understand how the Trevi Fountain was in Glasgow. Surely 20 of the world leaders and their entourages couldn't be in Rome on the same day that they were meant to be in Glasgow, could they? Wouldn't that mean lots of unnecessary travel in order to meet with the same people in a different place, many miles and countries away? Or perhaps I totally misunderstand the drivers of climate change. So the talks today, we're going to have one live talk from Professor Cathy Payne, who I'll introduce in just a few seconds, who's going to talk about sustainability in our future cities based on her own research. And we've also got a recorded talk from Dan Fernbank, our Energy and Sustainability Director here at the University of Reading, who will talk about sustainability on campus and how we aim to be net zero by 2030. Please note that for the Q&A, Cathy will of course answer all the questions that are all of them very fully that are asked during the Q&A, but Dan is not here for the Q&A, but we are encouraging you, please do post the questions in the Q&A on the university's own plan for sustainability, and they'll be going back to Dan, who will also prepare a blog based on this in response. So we'll just get on with the presentations today. So thank you for joining once again, and I'm going to hand over to Cathy Payne. Now Cathy, who I know very well from the Prosperity and Resilience theme, I didn't say who I was, but I'm the Research Dean for Prosperity and Resilience, is a Professor of Real Estate Development here in Real Estate and Planning at Henley Business School. Her research focuses on sustainable city and regional development, governance and planning under conditions of contemporary globalisations, and she is also co-director of the Globalisation and World Cities Research Network. So over to you, Cathy.
So as Adrian said, I'm going to be talking about sustainability and the future city, and obviously from the introduction which Adrian's kindly given me, cities is what I do in terms of research. But I guess the question for today, and then thinking about COP26, is why the focus on cities? So as context, as we know that there is a climate emergency, there's a great deal of talk about what the possible causes of it might be. This slide summarises some of the thinking to date on the relationship between some of the drivers of that emergency and how they relate to cities. So you can see here that we've got a sort of city nexus around the economy, where the economy is based, producing 80% of global economic output, around energy consumption, and as you can see here, we've got 70%, and then energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, again, very high, about the same as the consumption. All of that's happening in cities worldwide, and of course cities are growing, both in terms of their population size and in terms of their geographical extent. So what we're actually seeing here is a real global urban challenge in terms of the climate emergency, because we're living now in a 21st century urban demographic. Urbanization is planetary. And actually, as the UN pointed out some time ago, the battle for sustainable development will be won or it will be lost in cities. And we can see there on that slide, bottom right, that what's happened in the world is that we've had some very important changes in the economy globally. So we've had an economic shift from agricultural production in rural areas to industrial production. And of course, the UK, including Reading, were bound up in that industrial revolution. So it all started here. And then moving on to the post-industrial era, and the UK is very much involved in that as well, especially London and the other core cities in the UK. So because of that economic shift, what we're seeing is that more and more people across the world are moving to cities, because cities are where the industrial revolution is still happening and the post-industrial revolution is still happening. It's where they can earn a living and where they can be fairly sure that their longevity of themselves and their families will be well established. So we are very much living in global times, and we're living in cities in global times. So this image here, which is from one of my publications, purchased from the Financial Times, I should say, and rebranded for this publication. But the spin is that this is what the world now looks like in terms of one location. So you can see there that there's a bit of a spoof around probably where that city is in the world. But that sort of is an image of really what a typical globalized city now looks like. And of course, it looks great. But of course, the reality is a bit different. And this is one of the pictures from one of my trips abroad, showing how that built up area and the high tower blocks and so on. And of course, you can see there in the foreground, I'm in a moving vehicle, lots of intense traffic flows within those cities, as well as between them. You know, this is what is causing some of the relationships between economy, energy and emissions, that city nexus that I mentioned on one of my earlier slides. So what are we doing wrong when we're thinking about climate action? Well, I haven't got the figures here, but I did do a survey once to see how many climate change documents even refer to the word city once. And it's incredibly low, the incidence of the word city or urban appearing in any of the documents. So even though we know that cities are important in this, actually there's a real difference between how climate change is discussed in literature, in news briefings and so on, and at international conferences, and the reality of the importance that it has. So the term there, anthropogenic, basically means that climate change is being caused by humans. That is well established now. And in order to understand climate change, though, we need to understand people, where they live, very much in cities nowadays, and travelling within those cities and between them. But of course, climate action at the moment, as we can see from COP26, is very much focused on states, nation states, international political relations, high profile negotiations. And so we're sort of taking our eye in the media at the moment off cities as being really important in terms of dealing with the problems. And actually, we need to understand cities as social entities, socially functioning entities with very important multi-scale interactions, which are to do with people and the way they use cities and travel between them. So my research, all of it, is very focused on that latter point and trying to think about smarter ways of addressing the climate emergency going forward. This is just a slide to show one example of work that I've done. This one goes right back to the early 2000s, looking at how a polycentric metropolitan region, I'll show you another slide on one of those in the southeast of England in a minute, on how those across Northwest Europe could better inform sustainable development and climate action. This is a slide then showing the southeast of England, and what you can see here is commuting travel. This would be even more intense if you looked at business travel as well. But what you can see there is what looks like a spider's web of interconnected travel patterns. Reading is on there, of course, as well, to the west of London, which is interconnecting smaller cities and towns in the southeast to London through radial hub and spoke routes, which can be supported by public transport, but also cross-cutting movements which can't. So this was a first step in my research to understanding some of the problems around the interconnectivity of larger globalized cities and the globalizing ones around them, even though they're much smaller, and the problem that poses. And just to say on that one, that one of the ridiculous things at the moment, in my view, is that we're still talking about public travel demand management. So in other words, we all know that we've got high rail costs in the UK, which stops a lot of people from just jumping on a train to do a trip if they could travel by train to get there. Also, of course, for people working and attending meetings, there's the question of the reliability of the services on those routes. But in addition to that, we've had a problem of, trains which don't have enough carriages, so that I, for example, have been travelling up to the north of England for research discussions with policymakers and stood the entire way crammed in. And with COVID-19, of course, we've realised that there are all sorts of issues around that kind of over-intensive use of carriages. So we're still talking about travel demand management. There's a current DOT toolkit about that, published in 21. So obviously that goes against the idea of getting people out of their cars and onto trains. This is just a cover from another book that I did, a huge project looking at the whole of the European Union before Brexit, looking at how cities within small and large cities are interconnected within that macro region, and how that positions them in the world. And, despite Brexit, the functional relations between those cities in Europe still stands. That hasn't changed. What has changed, obviously, is the policy context around it. This is another project, example 3. This one, in fact, was for an organisation called the Urban Land Institute, and also the Coalition for Urban Transitions. That's a climate change initiative, where we looked specifically at the question of urban density. And what we found from this research was that the research on the relationship between density and the carbon emissions situation are very compelling. Basically, increases in urban density lead to decreases in direct per capita carbon emissions and, of course, energy consumption if we look across vehicles and buildings. So very compelling evidence there on the need for compact development. But this raises questions about what kind of compact development. This is just showing you an image. This was created, in fact, by our Institute for Environmental Analytics here at Reading University, which is using London data on emissions. And what you can see there is that the huge density of emissions is in particular places, but that is actually coming through travel routes from the wider region and beyond. So cars that are consuming energy that are coming from elsewhere outside London travel into London. They deposit a lot of emissions, particularly in very dense areas, so around Heathrow on the west there, and in central London, where you've got the economic cluster, which means that even though dense cities in general are better on emissions and energy consumption, they nevertheless suffer from the deposit of those in the air quality of those places. This is just another slide to show you. This again is from the Institute for Environmental Analytics here at Reading, showing you how from that project we produced a visualization tool which would allow decision makers, that would be investors, for example, in real estate and property, and also policymakers, to understand exactly how these kinds of flows and interconnections are being grounded in particular places in London and beyond London. But of course, this could be extended to other cities around the world, this kind of technology. And this is just a final slide showing what we're doing now. So this is my example 4. This work is being supported by a project called TRUDE, which is funded by the Medical Research Council, which aims to prevent non-communicable diseases. Obviously, there is a link, we now realise, because of COVID-19, between non-communicable diseases in cities and communicable diseases, because not everybody can afford to work from home, for example. But nevertheless, this is looking at what we can do so that we can build cities and invest cities in a more sustainable way. And the particular slide that I'm sharing with you here is some work that we're developing with Transport for Greater Manchester. Greater Manchester Combined Authority is one of the partners that we have in this project. And what we're doing with them is looking at how, for Greater Manchester, we can measure and assist the change from one form of mobility to another. So moving between cars to people travelling more on their feet or in public transport, but particularly on feet, because of course, if you can get people out of their cars, it helps in terms of air quality, but also it helps in terms of their health because they're moving and they're mobile. So what we're doing here is we're applying agent-based behavioural modelling, which that is developed on the basis of social sciences theory and concepts, where we can use GIS, geographical information systems, and other kinds of smart data to be able to follow how people are moving and how they're changing from one kind of mobility to another. So the idea is that we get a win-win, a virtuous cycle of people becoming more healthy, improving their air quality, and creating healthier places. So that's just my last slide to show you the current work, which is very exciting, and we're developing that with Greater Manchester Combined Authority at the moment. Of course, it's my last slide, and of course what it does pose in terms of thinking about questions you might want to ask and further considerations and discussion is what we can do as individuals. So we can do the research, but in the end of the day, it's individuals and policymakers, investors and decision makers who are creating cities who really need to work together across those three in order to make an actual change. So that was my last slide, I think. Yes, this is my contact details if you'd like to get in touch later. And I'm going to stop my presentation now.
So thank you very much, Kathy, for that very clear presentation and drawing upon your own personal research as well, which I'm always inspired to hear from you. Just reflecting on that, we do really want to see lots of questions. Some of them have come up already. Let's hope we can see a few more. What was I thinking? I don't want to predict some questions for Kathy to make it difficult for her, but have rumours of the death of the city being greatly exaggerated, for instance, and perhaps we could think about that. Next up, we're going to queue up a pre-recorded presentation from our own Dan Fernbank, who is the university's Energy and Sustainability Manager, who leads a committed team within the Estates Department. Dan has led many initiatives to change the way we manage our campus and buildings and was named Public Sector Energy Manager of the Year at the Energy Management Awards in 2019. So I think hopefully we're ready to watch that pre-recorded presentation now.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Fernbank, Energy and Sustainability Director, and I'm going to be talking today about our net zero carbon plan, really introducing the plan itself and our ambition and explaining what it means for energy in our buildings, what it means for our travel related emissions, and setting out a pathway towards net zero carbon. So the university has set itself an ambition to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2030. And I think it's firstly worth explaining what we mean when we say net carbon emissions. So very much that means reducing our carbon emissions as much as we can. And then anything that remains, we need to improve natural carbon capture, such as through plants and through land, to make sure that we remove as much carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere as we are emitting in the first place. So it's worth explaining when I talk about carbon and carbon dioxide that really what I mean is greenhouse gases in total. It's just shorthand. And then the target of 2030, I think, is also important to look at. That is one of the most ambitious targets that any UK university has set. And I think really that's come out of feedback that we had both from the University Executive Board, but also from the consultation on the university's strategic plan a couple of years ago, that there was really a feeling that we wanted to be authentic and ambitious in our sustainability leadership. And I'm pleased to say that our net zero strategy has been shortlisted for Net Zero Strategy of the Year by the Energy Managers Association. So we wait to hear the outcome of that in the next few weeks. And it's worth explaining what we're actually including in our carbon footprint. And as I said, our footprint is quite large and quite ambitious. And the slide here really illustrates our footprint and how that has changed over the last few years. So we compare against a baseline of 2009, when we had about 44,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions. And we have met our 35% carbon reduction target in 2016, and we've now met and slightly exceeded our 45% carbon reduction target for July 2021. So you can see here that what's included and what remains of our carbon footprint is heating and electricity in our buildings, travel emissions, and then a number of small things as well, such as water and waste that add up to just a small amount of our overall carbon footprint. And I think what's really important underlying that is just how much we have reduced in terms of our expected emissions over the last 12 years. 167,000 less tonnes of carbon dioxide emitted than what we expected, and that is equivalent to every member of staff and all of our students taking a return trip from London to Sydney twice. So some really big impacts that these cuts have had. So then moving on to building energy, what does it mean for our buildings? Well, firstly, we need to be more efficient. We need to waste less energy, and we've done a lot of that already. We've invested over £6 million over the last 10 years in becoming more efficient. But of course there's still more we can do. You know, we've cut our electricity by 28% over those 10 years, but still more that we can do. And we've got a lot of work going on at the moment to make further impacts. So we are replacing over 5,000 lights at the moment with efficient LEDs. We have recently replaced the majority of our energy hungry catering ovens, and we've replaced a whole load of science lab equipment to continue to reduce those emissions and that energy use. But of course more we can do, and I think this particularly is an area where everybody can play a part. You know, we can all switch off lights when we leave a room, or turn off your monitor, turn off your computer or other equipment if it's safe to do so. And also report issues if you see issues, if you see wastage, do report them to us. You know, if you've got an idea for how we can save energy, we are always open to ideas, and we keep a very long and detailed register of all these ideas as they come through. The second part then of building energy use is our heating, and I guess this is probably our biggest challenge and our biggest opportunity. Most of our buildings, almost all of our buildings, are heated by burning fossil fuels, and we need to stop doing that by 2030. So 5 of our buildings already are heated with heat pumps, and really heat pumps are the solution for low carbon heating. And the good news, as I say, is that we have 5 buildings already, so we already understand what can be done, but it's going to be a big challenge to try and convert existing buildings to heat pump technology. But it's worth, I think, acknowledging a couple of sort of common misconceptions about heat pumps and about other alternative technologies. Firstly, in terms of heat pumps, that does not mean that buildings are going to be colder. Certainly it makes sense if we can make buildings more efficient before installing heat pumps, then it absolutely makes sense to do so. But heat pumps themselves are a very efficient technology. For every unit of energy that goes into a heat pump, you get 3 or 4 units of heat back out again. But the reality is, at the moment, heat pumps are expensive, and at the moment electricity is relatively more expensive than gas, so there are some challenges there. But as you may well have seen in the press recently, there is a lot of government support for heat decarbonisation, and we're really trying to make the most of that. I think the other point perhaps worth acknowledging is the potential for hydrogen to be an alternative heating system, which is sometimes talked about in the press. But in that respect, it's worth recognising the government just recently has said they're not even going to make a decision for another 5 years on whether hydrogen has a role to play in heating buildings. So really, if we're going to meet a 2030 target, we can't wait that long. So we will be very much pushing forward with heat pumps. And the good news is that we have already secured some funding to look at this further. And the graph here illustrates some of the big opportunities that we've clearly got with our heating systems, particularly the energy centre and district heating network on White Nights. It's a very big part of our heating footprint and could become even bigger. So if we can do something there to reduce our emissions, then we're taking a big step there, and we've got a grant application in at the moment that we should hear about in a month or so to really look at a detailed design to start to decarbonise that energy centre. And then the third part of building energy is our electricity and opportunities for renewables. Back when I joined the university 10 years ago, we were just installing some solar panels. I was really excited to see we were installing solar panels on the Estates building and the Carrington building. And great to see, but unfortunately the government incentives at the time changed quite rapidly, and we weren't able to do anything further with renewables for a number of years. So those two systems were only contributing 0.1% of our total electricity demand. And in fact, until 2 years ago, we hadn't reached 1% of our energy coming from our own renewables. But since then, we've come a long way, and we now have 4% of our energy coming from renewables directly on our buildings, which still sounds small, but it is starting to throw up some interesting challenges because of the peaky nature of solar generation. There are times when we risk releasing energy sort of back to the national grid, which is not a particularly good thing to do for us financially because we don't get paid for it. So some interesting challenges that we're going to need to think about further as we expand. The other thing that we may look to do around renewables is look at the potential to partner with somebody locally, such as a new wind turbine or a hydro scheme or a solar farm, to commit to buying all of the energy from such a scheme, so that we're helping to bring new renewables onto the grid that we can commit to buy the energy from. So the other big part of our emissions is our travel emissions, our business travel. And this slide, similar to the one that I showed previously, shows our carbon footprint. It shows our actual carbon footprint at the end of July 2021, so our 12 months to July 2021. And what you can see here is that we had virtually no travel emissions last year because, of course, we weren't able to travel anywhere. But what this highlights is that actually we had reduced our carbon emissions by 65% rather than that target of 45%. Now, obviously, that's temporary, but it does illustrate, what a big impact our business travel has. And I guess, one of the things that the shutdown and the cessation of travel has demonstrated is the potential to use alternative technologies. as well as sometimes the limitations of doing so. But clearly what we do need to think about is where we can cut our travel, then we should do so, and where we can use alternative lower impact travel, such as high-speed rail, then again we should do so. But then anything that remains, and there will be remaining emissions, we need to look at either carbon offsetting or carbon insetting. And the difference between the two is that offsetting is really paying somebody else to capture the equivalent amount of emissions that we're releasing, whereas carbon insetting is really much more about doing it ourselves, about looking at what we can do on our own land to capture emissions. And there's some interesting work started off actually measuring the carbon release from our land, so that over the next few years we can really develop those ideas further. So bringing all of that together, this now shows our pathway towards net zero carbon for 2030. So bringing the building energy and travel and insetting and offsetting opportunities together. And you can see that the blue chunk is reducing year on year in terms of our residual emissions. But there is still an element of offsetting needed. By 2030 we estimate at the moment that that's going to be about 22% of our original baseline emissions. But that will continue to reduce in the years after 2030, particularly because the national grid will continue to decarbonise, so more and more low carbon, zero carbon energy will be on a national grid. But also, there is the potential to reduce those travel emissions, and I think this graph doesn't fully reflect, those opportunities to reduce our travel emissions further. It just presents it as offsetting. So anything we can do to actually cut those emissions in the first place means that we need less offsetting or insetting in the future. So I wanted to finish with a plug for our Green Festival and our rebranded Sustainable Behaviours programme, which we're relaunching this week, now called Doing Your Bit. And really that's a great way of helping you to understand how you can contribute to our sustainability ambitions, as well as winning points and competing for prizes along the way. Thank you for listening.